This is it, and see you in July.
By the spring of 2009, Michael Jackson was fighting for something bigger than a comeback tour. He was fighting to prove that the man the world had spent a decade doubting could still command a stage, still command an audience, still command his own name. Every rehearsal, every meeting, every note he gave his creative team was a move in a much larger game, one where the stakes were not just 50 sold-out nights in London, but whether Michael Jackson still belonged at the center of the world he had once ruled completely. Behind him stood a promoter with hundreds of millions riding on his health, a production company that needed him upright and rehearsing on schedule, and a personal physician whose loyalty had quietly been bought in a way almost no one around him fully understood. If you want to see how the machinery around a falling king actually operates in real time, stay with this because what follows is not the story most people think they already know. In public, everything about this is it looked like ambition. In private, it was leverage. And Michael was surrounded by people who each had something to gain from keeping the show moving forward no matter what it cost him. Dr. Conrad Murray had been hired at a rate reportedly close to $150,000 a month, a sum far beyond what his private practice could offer, and one that made his employment entirely dependent on Michael's ability to keep performing. That single fact turned a doctor's oath into something more complicated than medicine. Keeping his patient alive and keeping his patient functional for rehearsal were supposed to be the same goal. They were not. Night after night, according to later testimony, Murray administered propofol, a powerful anesthetic never intended for home use, to help Michael sleep after years of documented insomnia. It worked, but it worked like a loan no one could ever fully repay. Each dose bought a few hours of rest and quietly deepened a dependency that nobody with real authority was positioned, or perhaps willing to interrupt. This was the hidden threat sitting underneath every smiling rehearsal clip the world would later see. An arrangement that made Michael's continued health financially convenient for almost everyone standing near him, and dangerously optional for the one person contracted to protect it. Meanwhile, the production pressure kept climbing. Insurance requirements, promoter deadlines, and a media narrative built entirely around redemption meant that any sign of Michael's fragility had to be managed quietly, never publicly acknowledged. When his voice grew faint during late-night conversations, when his body seemed to slow between takes, those moments were absorbed into the daily rhythm of the production rather than treated as warnings. Everyone around him had reasons, financial and professional, to interpret exhaustion as ordinary and to keep the machine running exactly as scheduled. Michael himself pushed just as hard from the inside. He wanted the vision in his head, the lighting, the choreography, the emotional peak of every song, translated exactly onto the stage. And he drove himself according to that standard even as his body was reportedly beginning to fail him in ways few people around him chose to say out loud. He was, by every account, still fully present creatively, still shaping decisions down to the smallest visual detail, which made it even easier for those around him to believe that whatever was happening beneath the surface could not be that serious. A man that sharp, that involved, that in control of his own show, surely could not be as fragile as the rumors already circulating suggested. That belief, convenient for almost everyone in the room, would soon prove to be the most dangerous assumption of all. Because behind the calendar of scheduled rehearsals, behind the choreography notes and lighting cues, a private arrangement between one man's failing body and another man's financial survival was quietly accelerating toward a collision nobody in that production had planned for, and nobody wanted to be the one to stop. What none of them could see yet was how quickly the balance of power in that room was about to shift, how a single missed signal, buried inside an ordinary rehearsal week, would soon force every one of them to answer for exactly how much they had chosen not to notice, and how much time they had quietly assumed they still had left before the ugly truth caught up with all of them. The rehearsal room at Staples Center told one story. The nurse's phone told another. Weeks before the final collapse, Michael reportedly reached out to Cherylyn Lee, a registered nurse who had worked with him in the past, describing a strange and specific symptom, one half of his body running hot while the other half felt cold. He was calling from Florida at the time, and Lee, alarmed by what she heard, told him plainly that this was not something to manage from a distance. He needed to be seen in person immediately. It was the kind of warning that should have stopped a production in its tracks, a physical red flag serious enough that a nurse who barely had the full picture still recognized it as dangerous. Instead, the message reportedly got passed along secondhand, filtered through a security chief, softened somewhere between the person who raised the alarm and the people positioned to act on it. Nobody cancelled a rehearsal. Nobody paused the schedule. The show's internal clock kept ticking exactly as if nothing had been said at all, and that quiet act of letting a genuine warning simply pass through the system without consequence was itself a decision, even if no single person ever framed it that way out loud. Around the same time, the production's demands were only intensifying. This as it was no longer a loose comeback concept. It had become a fully contracted commitment with dates locked, tickets sold, and financial exposure spread across promoters, insurers, and a production company that had already invested enormously in Michael's ability to perform night after night in London. That kind of commercial machinery does not pause easily for a vague symptom, described Secondhand. It moves forward on schedule, on momentum, on the assumption that whatever is wrong will resolve itself before it becomes anyone's problem to solve. Michael, for his part, appeared to interpret his own body the same way the production did, as an obstacle to manage rather than a warning to heed. He kept pushing through rehearsals, kept refining choreography, kept obsessing over lighting cues and visual details with the same intensity he always had, because slowing down was never a language this show, or this era of his life, had been built to speak. Behind closed doors, according to later accounts, Dr. Murray was managing that same body with increasingly serious measures, administering propofol nightly to counter an insomnia that had reportedly worsened as the pressure of the tour intensified. Each night brought temporary relief. Each night also pushed further into territory that had no real precedent in a home bedroom, monitored by one physician instead of the surgical team and equipment such a drug would typically require in any hospital. The gap between what the production believed was happening, a demanding but manageable comeback, and what was actually happening in that bedroom each night, an increasingly precarious medical situation with almost no safety net, was widening by the day. Nobody with the authority to stop the schedule seemed to have the full picture. Nobody with the full picture seemed to have the authority, or perhaps the will, to stop the schedule. That gap between knowledge and power was not an accident. It was the exact condition every person around Michael had quietly allowed to form, each convinced someone else was watching closely enough, each telling themselves the warning signs did not yet demand a real intervention, and each about to discover, in a matter of days, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. There was a version of this story where someone in that room made a different choice. Where the security chief who heard about the hot and cold sensation running through Michael's body called for a doctor entirely outside the production's inner circle, someone with no financial stake in whether rehearsals continued on schedule. Where Murray, faced with a symptom he could not fully explain, insisted on tests and monitoring, stepping back from nightly propofol until an actual diagnosis was in hand. That version was still available right up until the final days. The warning had been given. What was missing was not knowledge, it was action. And the space between hearing a warning and acting on it was where this entire tragedy would ultimately take root. Every person in that chain held a piece of a puzzle that, assembled correctly, pointed toward exactly the kind of catastrophic, irreversible emergency the entire world would soon witness within just a matter of days. By the third week of June, the pressure inside that production had reached a point where every decision carried more weight than anyone wanted to admit out loud. Rehearsals were intensifying, London dates were locked into a calendar nobody was willing to move, and Michael himself was reportedly torn between two competing versions of the truth, the version where he was fine, capable, ready, and the quieter version where his body was beginning to send signals that fine was no longer accurate. Those two truths could not both survive contact with a schedule ahead, and something in that arrangement was going to have to give. What makes this moment feel less like an accident and more like a slow-motion collision of competing interests is how many people, in hindsight, appear to have sensed that something was wrong without any single one of them stepping forward to stop the machine. If you're watching this, ask yourself honestly what you would have done standing in that room, because the uncomfortable answer for most people is that pressure this large tends to silence individual judgment rather than sharpen it. Inside the Carolwood home, the nightly routine had settled into something disturbingly stable on the surface. Propofol administered to induce sleep after another day of demanding rehearsal monitored, according to Murray's own later account, by one physician working largely alone in a private bedroom, without the surgical support staff or equipment that would typically accompany that drug's use in any hospital setting. Reportedly, in earlier nights, Murray had attempted alternative sedatives first, hoping to wean Michael away from his growing reliance on propofol specifically, an effort that, if true, suggests at least some awareness inside that bedroom of exactly how dangerous the path they were on had become. But awareness without a change in behavior accomplishes very little, and night after night, the routine reportedly returned to the same drug, the same dosage pattern, the same fragile arrangement holding together a man's ability to function under pressure that showed no signs of easing. Meanwhile, outside that bedroom, the production's momentum only intensified. Rehearsal footage from these final days shows a man completely engaged, adjusting lighting cues, refining choreography, reviewing visual concepts with the same obsessive attention to detail that had defined his entire career. To everyone watching those rehearsals unfold, Michael looked like a performer at the peak of his creative powers, fully in command of every element of his show. That image, genuine as it may have been in the moment, existed alongside a private reality almost nobody in that rehearsal room had full visibility into, a body being chemically managed each night just to make the next day of that same rehearsal possible at all. The gap between the public performance of readiness and the private mechanics required to sustain it was now as wide as it had ever been, and the machinery keeping that gap invisible, financial incentive, professional loyalty, and a shared unwillingness to be the one who stopped the show, was about to run out of road entirely. In less than 72 hours, every quiet assumption holding that fragile balance together would be tested at once, and the outcome of that test would not depend on rehearsal footage, choreography notes, or lighting cues. It would depend on a single locked bedroom door, a doctor alone with his patient, and a decision made or not made in the minutes that followed. Before we get to that morning, it's worth pausing on something easy to miss the first time through this story. Michael Jackson had spent his life being watched, managed, and monetized by people whose incentives did not always align with his well-being, going back years. The pattern forming in these final weeks was not new. It was simply the latest version of an arrangement that had followed him since childhood, a circle of professionals whose livelihoods depended on his continued performance. That history matters because it explains why nobody in the room in June of 2009 behaved as though this moment was exceptional. It felt like business as usual, the same pattern that had always resolved itself before. What none of them accounted for was that this time, the body absorbing all of that pressure had less room left to absorb it than it once did. If you want to understand how a legend's final days can look completely ordinary right up until they aren't, subscribe now, because this channel exists to pull apart exactly these kinds of stories.